Hey everyone, welcome to lecture 7. So this is the final lecture of the first half of the course. So what that means for you is that pretty much everything through this lecture and prior to it can be covered on the midterm exam. After the midterm exam, you can forget all of it if you want to. No, I hope that you don't, but we'll start anew for the final exam, so it won't be cumulative. So everything after the midterm exam will be covered on the final here. But so this is the last lecture 7 on foreign policy development. If you look at the progress of this class to date, we have gone from sort of looking at some of the basic definitions that are brought up or used extensively in international relations. We then focus a lot of attention on those foundational models of international relations, those frameworks that try and explain how countries and state actors behave towards one another. And now we're shifting more into the actual implementation of foreign policy and international relations and the institutions and organizations that do so. So today we want to talk at a high level about foreign policy development. So how a state formulates its foreign policy in response to different events and things going on in the world. So let's go ahead and jump in. So what is foreign policy? Well, foreign policy is how a country basically deals with other states and how it approaches future interactions and relations with other states. This can be influenced by a lot of factors, obviously political culture, history, traditions, the predominant ideological frameworks that we've talked about there. Foreign policy is often a reflection of the general natural interests of the states. So if you have a country that is non-interventionist, it probably reflects the interest of that state to not get involved in conflicts. If you have a state that's heavily dependent upon international trade, then they may be very interventionist, not a real word. These interests might be ideational in nature. So they may be oriented towards general ethical or moral sort of ideals or goals that a country wants to obtain. So maybe a country has maybe world peace is one of their ideational interests here. That's in contrast to what we would refer to as material interest. And so that's the actual things that I want to get and collect. So observable goals. So, for instance, the United States might have a goal of entering a free trade agreement with China, for instance. That is a material interest because it has material effects there. We classify states in 3 different ways here, and it's kind of important to note as we move on to this discussion of how foreign policy is implemented here. So 3 distinctions I want you to know. So pre-modern states are those in which citizens primarily identify with a common nationalistic authority, such as a religious institution or an ethnic community, for instance there. So, whether it's intentional or not on the behalf of the public, Iran, for instance, would be considered a pre-modern state because there's a national sort of Persian identity that, at least since the overthrow of the Shah, has been tied to the Islamic clerics in Iran there. That's in contrast to a modern state. So those are in which citizens primarily identify with the state itself. So the United States would be a good example of this in a lot of cases. So you would identify yourself as American. And in the U.S., our identity as Americans, just because we are such a melting pot of different cultures and ideas, is a little different than, in some places in the world where you might identify, like, for instance, Greece. If you live in Greece, there's probably it's a pretty homogeneous Greek culture there that you probably identify with more than the government and your political leaders and that sort of thing, which you would in a modern state. Now, in a postmodern state, these are countries in which the population is more cosmopolitan, and they see themselves as citizens of the globe. So don't really as much identify with as the citizen being a citizen of a religion. Don't even so much identify with the citizen being a citizen of sort of where you are. I use the example as a picture on the right of my kid here. We had gone to a castle outside of Amsterdam, and so we're back in the city. And he insisted on going down the streets dressed as a knight and defending Amsterdam. Amsterdam's a good example there because its history is one of international trade. It has a very cosmopolitan population. As a result, I think in our week there, we ate at restaurants representing 12 different countries, I think it was. I would argue that London, and the culture around London, for instance, and for many English, at least living in that space, would sort of be more reflective of kind of a postmodern state. So that's the distinction that we make there. So what motivates foreign policy decisions here? So look, even for the countries that are sort of most altruistic in their ideations and how they want things to be, foreign policy motivations are often, somewhat self-serving here. It generally represents a mix of realist and idealist goals here. So ensuring the security of your own citizens, ensuring the economic welfare of your citizens. So taking care of the Trump administration would be a good example of this, because they saw their America First policy as being focused on the economic interests of American citizens versus citizens in other parts of the world. Developing prestige and trust with other states. So for some countries, that's important, particularly if you're an intergovernmental organization and you feel like you need their help for things. Promoting a valued ideology or worldview. So it could be that you have a belief system that it's most important to you that you get that out. We would see, most of the Cold War was really a conflict between ideologies, between capitalist and communist or socialist type ideologies there. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. Expanding your territory or access over vital resources. So we've seen that a lot throughout history, less so recently, but of course, obviously, we have Russia invading Ukraine for an expansion of its territory commensurate with what they did in Crimea as well. Sorry, my wife is texting me for like the 40th time today. Seeking peace and stability globally. That could be the motivation there. Obviously you would think that most countries would want that, but that's not always the case. And so these different, ideas sometimes kind of come in conflict. I use the example of Okinawa in Japan there, where the U.S. As an agreement post World War II, maintains a military base there. My mom actually lived there because she was an Air Force brat when she was a kid. But for the people on Okinawa, it's very much a sore subject, because it is a valuable and important piece of land that belongs to another country. And so it's always a good thing to remind Americans about. Like, could you imagine if another country had a military base in Apex or something like that, and they had all this valuable land, and we had fighter jets and stuff screaming up, which I think would be awesome. But a lot of people wouldn't. People might have different feelings about that than we currently do, not having that. Foreign policy is dynamic in its nature here. So in many democratic states, it really changes with the leadership that's in place. I use the example here of Cuba. I think I've mentioned here before that I worked on some airline initiatives related to Cuba back during the Obama administration. So in 2015, Barack Obama ended the 54-year policy kind of hostilities towards U.S. and Cuba. His sort of case for this was, look, we've been doing this 54 years. The Castro family is still in power. Communism isn't going anywhere. The only people suffering are the Cuban citizens as a result. Maybe we should think about doing something different. So Barack Obama instituted this. I actually worked, the photo I took on the right there was, we had come in with Southwest Airlines. And so the tall gentleman towards the left of the photo, that's Gary Kelly, CEO of Southwest at the time. We all had these Cuban hats, and we came down to Havana, and this was actually a press conference we did, instituting flights between Tampa and Havana there. We had representatives of the Cuban government there. My wife came with me on that trip because she translates for me, and we ended up day tripping Cuba and then took a flight basically back that day, so it was kind of cool. 2017, Donald Trump said, no, I'm going to reverse these, and he reversed a lot of not all, but a lot of the policy decisions that Barack Obama had instituted related to Cuba. Some of that was a favor to Marco Rubio and the South Florida contingent. I could talk in greater detail about this because I know it pretty well, but there's a very big distinction in attitudes towards Cuba in South Florida versus in Tampa Bay. South Florida, obviously, you have a lot of Cuban exiles, people who were, lost their property, had it taken from the government, were imprisoned and faced all sorts of, political crimes, essentially, as a result of opposition to the regime there. And a lot of them migrated to Cuba. And there's a lot of ill will, obviously, towards the Castro regime. Tampa's history with Cuba was interesting because it mostly predated Castro and actually went back to the Batista era. So it was a lot more friendly towards Cuba. Cuba and didn't have the same history there. So two sort of conflicting cultures even within one state as it relates to foreign policy was kind of interesting. I don't know if I mentioned 2022 Joe Biden. He did reverse some of the Trump changes, but not all of those, and so we haven't seen a complete reversal of back to where kind of Obama had put things. Let's talk about the role of ambassadors. So most modern countries have foreign ambassadors stationed in the capitals of the nations for which they have good relations. These ambassadors are principally tasked with maintaining diplomatic relations, executing their country's foreign relations policy, that sort of thing. So they're doing the day-to-day work representing their country in that foreign state. There's an ambassador's row in Washington D.C. where you'll see the embassies for a variety of different countries there. In the U.S., ambassadors are appointed by the president. So I've gotten to visit the homes of several U.S. ambassadors, and generally, as you might imagine, they typically tend to be people who were donors or otherwise somehow connected to the president or to the political party. So these are fairly influential people there. They carry out the day-to-day duties of the U.S. at the embassies abroad. And so we have, as I'll talk about, 190 U.S. embassies there. They are staffed by the U.S. Marine Corps in addition to the Foreign Services officers there. So the U.S. Marines have a detachment at each of the embassies that protects the ambassador and then protects the embassy there as well. I'll give you your code word early in this one so I don't forget it. We'll make it Marine Corps here. My dad, who passed away last year, was a Marine, and a proud Marine. He didn't talk about it a whole lot, but he was a Marine nonetheless. And so it was a cool thing at his funeral when the Marines showed up to do taps and the flag ceremony, that sort of thing. So Marine Corps. But just make that as your code word here. You can provide that for me for attendance credit. Speaking of the embassies here, so 190 countries have U.S. embassies staffed by an appointed ambassador and then a team of foreign service officers. So in my American government class, we talk about civil service employees in the United States, such as postal workers. We have the foreign equivalent. They're the foreign service officers. And so to get one of these jobs, you take the foreign services exam. Do well, qualify. The challenge is that you can be sent, wherever they decide to send you. My wife, who had an interest in international politics, and is an immigration attorney and speaks Spanish, very much had an interest when she was younger in becoming a foreign services officer. And when she went to law school, she sort of changed her direction there. But I think it's something that's always intrigued her. And I think, if I remember correctly, a couple people in this class have mentioned that too. There, I've had the opportunity to work with them. Really smart people, really cool group of individuals here that know the countries extremely well. So their jobs in the embassies, maintaining relations with foreign officials, coordinating trade missions. So I did a lot of trade mission type work with delegations from American cities, and we'd bring them over there. I'd be there usually on behalf of the airport to facilitate trade of some form. They issue travel visas to the United States, and so a lot of my wife's clients, if they need to come to the United States, they go to a U.S. embassy to try and get a visa in that country to come over. Assist U.S. citizens traveling within the country. So, I would say if you wake up in a hotel and there's a dead body next to you and you're in a foreign country, you should probably run to the U.S. Embassy. You'll be met by the Marines out front, show them your passport, say, I'm an American citizen. When you're on U.S. Embassy grounds, you're technically in the United States, and so they can provide you a certain level of protection. I hope that information doesn't come handy to you one day, but I've certainly seen enough movies where that seemed relevant here. So we have about 11,000 U.S. citizens that serve as foreign service officers, but it's interesting, another 37,000 employees at embassies are actually foreign nationals that live in those countries. And so again, as I've traveled and visited embassies in the countries that I've been at for work purposes, most of the staff there are actually residents of that country that I happen to be in. So getting back to foreign policy here, one of the first steps, and we'll talk about the various steps here, starting with this one of how foreign policy is developed. And the first thing is that you have to identify the issue, right? The world's a big place. There's a lot going on, and we don't necessarily have good visibility into all of it. And even if we do, we may not necessarily care as the public, right? Different issues resonate with people a little more than others here. Oftentimes, it's a non-governmental organization or maybe the media or celebrities that will bring some of these issues to our attention, right? So for instance, when I developed these slides last year, there were several NBA players that were trying to sort of point attention to the Uyghurs, who I've mentioned previously, the Islamic sect in China that has been facing oppression. The NBA, for its part, did exactly what you think they would do and try to shrug it off, because China is actually a huge source of revenue for the NBA. In China, basketball is hugely popular there, and the NBA and its commissioner don't necessarily want to upset their Chinese overlords, and so they've tried to sort of squash this. But we have these professional athletes in this example bringing this to our attention. The domestic front, same thing. You could think of Colin Kaepernick, for instance, kneeling during the national anthem. Arguably not because he hates the national anthem, but because he was trying to bring attention to a policy issue that was very important to him. Certainly, some people agree with the decision, some people don't, and that's fine. I won't, obviously go into that. Just the point saying that, somebody has to bring attention to it. One of the other ways that this happens is through policy think tanks. So these can be, these are essentially organizations that have sort of a policy focus, that do research. A lot of my graduate school classmates went on to work for these think tanks here, and they span, some of them are non-partisan, some of them are ideological left, some ideological right. Groups like the Brookings Institute, Rand Corporation, Center for American Progress. Like I said, some of them will have an ideological stance here, and they'll do policy research that generally tries to support that stance and their narrative. So the next phase here is policy formation, right? So once we've identified that there's an issue that we need to address, this phase represents the second step, where we decide, or the government decides, how we want to take some action, or whether or not we want to take action. In the United States, it's typically the executive branch that is most concerned with foreign policy matters. As we talked about, actually, we didn't talk about it. We talked about my American politics class. The U.S. president is the only one that can enter treaties and agreements with foreign states here. But we do have the Congressional, Foreign Relations Committee, so they are very active in this as well. That's a very highly sought after committee appointment if you can get it there. So the president is certainly going to work to some extent with the foreign relations committees in both the House and the Senate to identify, do we need to develop a policy? And if we do, what does it look like? And you can certainly think, obviously, these cabinets have been, or these committees rather, have been very active in terms of the United States' response to the war in Ukraine, and deciding what the U.S. policy should be. Anything from do nothing all the way to send in the fighter jets and let's fight alongside them. And so far, at least at the time I'm filming this, our response has been to provide military aid in terms of finances and weapons and that sort of stuff. Then there's the implementation phase. So it's one thing for the president or Congress to say this is our policy, but it actually has to be executed here. There are a variety of different government agencies that do that, and also agencies that aren't a part of the government or any government at all. So, we could utilize the CIA or the State Department, for instance. Homeland Security could execute our foreign policy strategy. U.S. aid is focused on, foreign aid to countries that need it. It would be an example there. And then obviously the Department of Defense, there's no better way to carry out your foreign policy than to send your military over there, or lob bombs or missiles or what have you there. There's also organizations that are contracted with the government here to carry out some of these actions. Usually this is a case where they have very specific expertise or can be operating more efficiently. On the happy-go-lucky side, you have these organizations like Doctors Without Borders, for instance, that the U.S. wants to give aid to help with some health crisis in another part of the world. They can give it to Doctors Without Borders, who can take it and then implement it there. On the less happy side, you have these private security firms, for instance, that essentially serve as de facto U.S. military presence in many countries. So, for instance, in Iraq, after a lot of the U.S. forces had pulled back or pulled out of the country, it was groups like Blackwater and these private security organizations that kind of filled that void there. Country can also work through an intergovernmental organization, which is what we'll talk about increasingly as we move through this class, such as the United Nations. So UNICEF, for instance, which provides vital aid to children in third world countries and families, that is an arm of the United Nations. So that's something the United States can support, and then through the UN, carry out its foreign policy preferences. The next phase, or really kind of the final phase, is the policy evaluation phase, where we take a look at what we wanted to do, we take a look at what we did, and we evaluate how well the two of those matched up here. So this is typically done through things like congressional hearings, maybe a university or a think tank series of studies here. This step, really looks to understand the costs and benefits of a foreign policy relative to its objectives here and whether such objectives are achieved. So as you might imagine, if you look at, for instance, the Foreign Services Committee, somebody who's very opposed to the president's policy that was implemented is probably going to argue for why they don't think it was very successful. Maybe the president's supporters do the opposite there. This policy process is often steeped in very subjective interpretations of what works and what doesn't, and what is a good outcome for specifically as it relates to certain doctrines. So we're going to talk about a series of U.S. foreign policy doctrines here, but these are really ideological frameworks applied to specific regions or types of government there. So it's going to be a very targeted foreign policy, but somewhat broad in kind of its description here. So this will make more sense as we get into these on the next slide. So let's go through the history of some of the major U.S. foreign policy doctrines here. We'll start with the Monroe Doctrine. It goes back to 1823, argued that foreign nations should not engage in future colonization in the Americas in the exchange for the U.S. Remaining neutral in European wars. So think about this time, 1823. We've just won the second war for independence, the War of 1812. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves. All of a sudden, we start looking south and saying, yeah, there might be some exportable resources in Central and South America that we can take advantage of. You know what? We're probably best suited to do that. Let's find a way to stop European countries from coming over here and basically taking the resources and going back across the Atlantic with them. So the agreement of the Monroe Doctrine said, hey, look, stay out of Latin America. Or the Americas in general, and we won't get involved in your European wars and that sort of thing. In 1904, you have, so this is, 3/4 of a century later, you've got the Roosevelt corollary to this, Teddy Roosevelt's corollary, which specifically said the U.S. has a natural interest in developing its interests in Latin America because we're here and you're not. So again, stay out of Latin America. This is about the time of the Panama Canal project. The U.S. wanting to control shipping across the Panama Canal. With the cooperation of the Panamanian government. Speaking of my Marine father, the closest he got to action in the Marines was actually on a boat locked and loaded outside of Panama in the late 70s. And fortunately, they weren't called in. Diplomatic relations were able to be established, and the Marines didn't need to land there. Let's fast forward a little bit. 1947, the Truman Doctrine from Harry Truman claimed that the spread of communism was a threat to free democratic societies. This permitted, according to Truman, the U.S. Engaged in global intervention to stop communism. So we've just come out of World War II. Germany's in shambles. France is still in shambles. The UK is broke. Japan has really obviously taken a devastating hit to their economy and culture. Really, the main powers that are emerged of the United States and the Soviet Union there. The U.S., and this is a topic for a different class, but obviously the very industrial capitalistic nature of the United States was very much in opposition to the ideas of the Bolshevik Revolution in Soviet Union and Soviet communism there. So Truman very early on said, hey, that thing where you take the resources and you spread them out to all of the people instead of allowing private companies and enterprise to thrive, that's bad. We're going to stop it wherever we can across the globe so it doesn't come to our shores. That ends up being the catalyst for basically the next half century of U.S. foreign policy doctrine, as we'll talk about here in a second. So you've got the Eisenhower Doctrine, 1957. This laid forth that the U.S. government would come to the aid of any country requesting security or economic assistance from Soviet aggression. This coincides obviously with the Korean War, but really the dominoes starting to fall, particularly in Asia and Southeast Asia. These are going to be the events that lead up to the Vietnam War. The United States was very concerned at this time about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia and basically it taking a greater foothold. In part because obviously it would affect our ability to engage in trade in that part of the world. In 61, you've got the Kennedy Doctrine, committed the U.S. to stopping the spread of communism through Latin America. There's a really fascinating history. And one of my roommate in graduate school, his area of focus was Latin American politics, so he could talk to you all day about this. There were three of us that were really good friends in graduate school: him, another woman, and myself. And the two of them ended up getting married, and so the party came came to an end. But yeah, Kennedy Doctrine. And so we, as the United States, got heavily involved in Latin America during the 60s and 70s. This is part of it. Again, it comes back to the Cuban Revolution. But Che Guevara, the guy you may recognize from the T-shirt there, was actually killed by the CIA. We went down there and basically killed him because he had this knack for going into various Latin American countries, sparking a revolution, and then eventually pissing off the leader of that country and moving on to the next one. So we had him executed as a result of that. So that was a function of the Kennedy Doctrine here. Nixon Doctrine in '69 changes things up a little bit here. Established that U.S. allies would be responsible for their own defense through, though the U.S. would provide aid and respond to nuclear threats. So obviously, if you think about the time here, this is coming in. This is the start of the Vietnam War, right? So the Nixon Doctrine was, if you look at Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam is amazing. If you get a chance to watch it, it's I forget how many parts it's done in, but I feel like my wife took a Vietnam history of the Vietnam War class in college, and she said I could just watch this documentary and I would have gotten the same education there. So check it out if you can. But one of the things that's sort of driven home is at the beginning of the Vietnam War, we were just there as advisors. We were arming and training the South Vietnamese forces to fend off aggression from North Vietnam. It wasn't until later, until that started to not go so well, that the U.S. took more of an active role. But for Nixon's part, he tried to sort of create that separation there. Getting to more modern times here, Reagan Doctrine. So this is 1980, the year I was born, set forth a policy of the U.S. arming anti-communist guerrillas. So again, we're not going to go down into Latin America and fight these conflicts against these communist leaders, but we will certainly send weapons and train your military. That leads to the Oliver North scandal, which is a whole other thing about what we were doing and how involved we were in Latin American efforts to combat socialist and communist leaders there. Fast forwarding a little further ahead, you've got the Bush Doctrine, George W. Bush, 2001. Obviously, this is right after the September 11th attacks. This set forth a policy of preemptive war against potential threats to the United States. So the idea here was that, look, we waited on our laurels and we got attacked. Now we need to be preemptive about it and attack these countries before they can attack us. And lo and behold, that's how we ended up in Iraq for the next 2 decades to follow. The Obama Doctrine in 2009. So this one's interesting because generally scholars of the Obama administration would say that his foreign policy doctrine was very realist, which we don't typically associate with Democratic or progressive politicians here. But they say, look, the capture of Osama bin Laden was a perfect example. Barack Obama didn't request, that the Pakistani government allow us to go in and essentially violate their sovereignty, send these fancy military helicopters in to conduct this raid. We just did it. And so there are a few other cases where, and it's interesting too, because, on the right, sometimes they would try and paint Obama as, weak on foreign policy. But those that were in the know, and even conservative think tanks that were writing on it, would say, yeah, not really. He looks a lot like us on, on some of these policy decisions here. The Trump Doctrine, so really kind of kicks off in 2017 here. It's really hard. Scholars have a hard time pinpointing it. It's very unpredictable but very nationalistic in nature, focused on rewarding allies for behaviors that we agreed with and punishing allies or other countries that didn't basically agree to our policy objectives. And so I think over time more will be kind of said about that. With regard to the Biden Doctrine, it hasn't really been established, but really I think U.S. intervention in Ukraine is really going to write that story, and I think we'll probably learn more about that as more scholars sort of study kind of the facts related to that. Okay, here's the duck. He says, sorry, I was asleep. I appreciate that. How does a country like the U.S. maintain foreign policy relations when they seem to change with administrations? Well, fortunately, and again, this I have the purview of having worked with foreign policy leaders. the staff at U.S. embassies generally remain the same from one president to another because they're protected. They're federal service officers, with the exception of the ambassadors. So when a new president of a political party comes in, they're probably going to replace that ambassador. So even though a new presidential administration comes in, the day-to-day work is largely the same. I can tell you I have some direct experience with that because I was working in Mexico and in Mexico City specifically when Obama was president, and then also when Trump was in the White House, and the tone of everything had shifted and changed. Obviously, Trump was a bit more antagonistic with regard to U.S. relations with Mexico, sort of in general. We're going to build a wall and you're going to pay for it, that sort of thing. And so it did affect things, but at the same time, we were still able to do trade missions. We were still able to connect American companies to Mexican companies. So a lot of that did not change. They're skilled, these State Department staff, at negotiating these changes, and so it's really quite impressive to watch them work. Foreign policy carrots, as we sort of get towards the end here. So a lot of times successful foreign policy is a function of trading expertise and resources that you have for something your partner needs or another country needs. So trade, actual trade, for instance, products and services that we need or they need. Military assistance. So particularly in a lot of developing countries where you have leaders that are trying to develop a security force, we do a very good job of sending our troops over to other countries to help them defend their sovereignty, as long as we are a fan of their sovereignty. Intelligence, sharing of information valuable to a diplomatic partner. So there's a heavy amount of intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Israel, as an example. And then foreign aid, right? So you have these disasters like, for instance, the horrible conditions in Turkey following the earthquake there, which is, just devastating to see those photos of. Obviously, our efforts there to help and assist in any way we can is something that we can leverage on the foreign policy front, in addition to everything else. We also use reciprocity. So this is a tactic for encouraging foreign policy agreements where each country reciprocates the policies of another. So for my honeymoon many years ago, we went down to Chile, and I remember we landed in Santiago, and I was quite surprised that we had to pay the entry fee that we did. I was like, this is nuts. I've been in other countries. It's crazy. And my wife, the immigration attorney, says, well, this is what we charge them. And so it's reciprocity. They just charge us the same amount. I was like, oh, that makes sense. Still sucks. So finally here, what are kind of the future foreign policy concerns? And we'll touch on this a few more times over the course of this semester here. So how will nationalist movements impact foreign policy relations moving forward? So we will talk more and more about nationalism and the resurgence of nationalist movements as it relates to, we've been in this period of liberal institutionalism where we focused all of our efforts on these intergovernmental organizations like the UN or the European Union. And now you have these nationalist groups saying, like, maybe we don't want to be a part of that. Will the hegemonic balance shift? How will rising and declining estates adjust in their roles? So we are sort of at a period, and depending on who you listen to, possibly the end of the American hegemony, where we are the lone superpower. For many years, observers have been pointing to the rise of the Chinese economy and the Chinese government as potentially a new dual hegemony, or perhaps U.S. influence declining here. Will our pro-capitalism foreign policy doctrine survive the growth in resource inequality across the world, right? So the United States, and so much of the conflict we've been involved in, has been in support of, if you think of, much of the U.S. Middle Eastern conflicts over the last really 30 years have been a function of protecting the U.S., the interests of the energy industries and other industries in that region of the world. At some point, when you look at countries where you have this great divide between the haves and the have-nots, it makes you wonder if that's sustainable over time. And will globalization give states less power to set foreign policies that prioritize state interests? And so particularly the purpose of the formation and the development of the European Union, for instance, was this idea that as a collective, we actually exert more influence than we would as separate countries here. And that is something that countries like the United States, as sort of somewhat standalone actors, will have to contest with. We'll talk more about that as we get further in the class. So that's meant to be a high level foreign policy development discussion here. For those that have an interest in foreign services, I would say that everybody I've talked to or worked with that was in that field seemed very excited about their jobs. And I've worked with a lot of people that have been doing it for decades. They've had to move around, more often than not, but then they settle in a place where they can become experts. And a lot of them have families of children, and they see huge benefits to that. So if that's an interest of yours, based on the experience of one guy traveling the world, I would say definitely check it out. I think it's a cool deal, and they do really important work. So that's it for foreign policy development. Like I said, last lecture before the midterm here. So hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much, guys.